Well, hey folks, it's your old pal, King Waspinator, and you know what time it is. That's right, it's time for Total Party Skills. Be sure to hit like and subscribe. So, since the cat has been let out of the bag that the good folks at Wizards of the Coast have finally earned enough experience by battling other Pokemon with Dungeons and Dragons that in a couple years D&D is going to evolve. And by having told this, I guess that kind of means that 5th edition as we know it is effectively a dead brand. So here at the end, I'm finally, I guess, giving some of my thoughts and insights on how to, look at the various races and classes from the core D&D player's handbook, and how to take them into consideration for the purpose of dungeon mastering. Some of the stuff I have to say about classes and races, might also, be good fodder for players to come up with ideas with how to portray their stuff. But, my videos are kind of more an emphasis on like how to build them into the setting that you're running in a way that it kind of creates like a sense of normality of what it's like to be this thing for your players by showing them in game as opposed to just handing them some reams of text or hoping that they'll sit through and read the whole book or whatever section of a source book you want them to read and all that kind of stuff. I already did the core races back in December. You can just go to my channel page and look through videos and you'll find them somewhere back there. I guess I could at some point start going through and organizing playlists, but hey, who's really got time for that? But I'm going to start with classes now. I'm going to break them down into 3 overall categories, 4 classes each. I might address Artificer, but I kind of have the least amount to say about that. It's relatively new and kind of an appendix class as far as I feel, but I'm going to talk about the 4 that I would describe as the wilderness classes today. That would be the Barbarians, Druids, Rangers, and Sorcerers. Barbarians are one of those classes that you should really consider whether or not you're even going to be making available to players, and in spite of 5th edition's setup where it's play whatever combination that you want. Depending on your setting, some race combinations with barbarians don't necessarily make sense. If you're doing like a kind of post-apocalyptic Dark Ages just after the fall of civilization kind of setting, similar to what I do in like my Orc and Bone setting, then having stuff like Tiefling barbarians and half-elf barbarians and stuff like that might make a little bit more sense. But in your average medieval style D&D setting, are you really going to see a high elf barbarian? No. They're good for humans. Dwarves, especially hill dwarves, seem to kind of fit a barbarian mold. I generally would actually try to steer wood elf players towards taking barbarian as an option. If you want to bring more of a wild elf kind of vibe to your wood elf and not just be some Legolas wannabe that you can make just as the same as with a high elf anyway. Gnomes, what, maybe like deep gnomes. What kind of settings are gnomes going to be barbarians? Like I said, if you're having some sort of like sudden recent collapse of all civilized society and it's all become some, like fantasy Mad Max free for all, then sure, some of the more cultured type races becoming barbarians in the aftermath, maybe, but. I don't know. I don't really necessarily feel that they're a good fit for everything. And so when you're designing your own, notes for, what kind of restrictions, and I do, recommend that you should have some restrictions, regardless of what game you're playing, on exactly what players are playing, because you want to, hone things down so they still have a wide amount of variety of options to choose from, no matter what. But they have some sort of theme that they all kind of hang their hook on that helps rope them together as a group in game. Once again, advice is advice. What works for me might not necessarily work for you, but that's kind of generally like my thinking when approaching these things. And barbarians, they can be intrusive, and the way they're written up is. They really read more like Viking berserkers with some shamanistic potential, depending on which kind of specialization you take as they level up. and they're obviously like very heavily influenced by like the Conan type stereotypes of what it is to be a barbarian. Like looking back at like what actual quote unquote barbaric peoples of history are like, how much they really fit up with that. I mean, it should be maybe perhaps more emphasis on horse riding and cavalry tactics than what you see in the D&D barbarian. Which is very also similar to the next one on the wilderness class list, which is druids. I am still not entirely sure where the modern fantasy conception of druids comes from. They're a mishmash of a bunch of like old Euro-pagan kind of mystic stereotypes, and given the title of druid seemingly because they plucked it out of a hat, what is actually was written of druids by contemporaries during Roman times describes them as kind of like a political priest class. Yes, they did conduct religious ceremonies and rituals, but the vast bulk of the time they're doing, your classic council of elders kind of work. Not quite kings, not quite nobles, but still like, a sun priest kind of caste that sits above just your common average farmer. To the point, where like stuff like sacred groves and forest imagery and animals were all part of the symbolism that druids may or may not have used in their ceremonies, is more derivative of the fact that they emerged from cultures that at the time, were not living in the giant stone and concrete planned cities yet. Not that they didn't have cities and agriculture, but their version of agriculture was not quite breaking down entire landscapes and kind of softcore re-terraforming it in quite the same way that the more civilized nations of the ancient world, like Rome, were doing and starting to do. And their cities were smaller and primarily like made out of wood and stuff like that when they didn't use natural features and outcropping, and it's not even like necessarily determined that they had anything to do with megalithic culture. The time period that druids were known to be around as a thing is divorced from the people who built Stonehenge and stuff like that by thousands of years. So like whatever connections they have are pretty nebulous. And so yeah, the way they're presented in Dungeons and Dragons is like these weird, like nature priests with shape-shifting abilities and like other kinds. I don't know. I've never really quite entirely understood exactly where the modern version of druids entirely comes from, because it only seems in the most basic, loosest way to be based on actual knowledge of what real druids were. In many ways, they seem to be more some kind of quasi-fictional, pseudo-Wiccan kind of, nature magic witchcraft kind of thing. Generally, when, using them in settings, they should be treated as part of, like the divine classes. They are a priestly order. If they're part of the civilized world in any degree, then you need to kind of figure out exactly how they stack into the hierarchy around, the other divine classes like clerics and paladins, and just regular lay priest NPCs and stuff like that. How do druids fit into the pantheon of the gods? It's even though they don't necessarily derive their spell powers from the gods, there's no reason why various druid circle cults wouldn't necessarily also venerate one or more of whatever regional gods are important to the setting. So in terms of going back to what actual druids were in the real world, investing them with like priestly social ceremony kind of duties within your world's culture might be something to do. Or alternatively, you can treat them as being like the priest version of a barbarian, and have them be part of the wilderness culture type thing, where they're a bit more restricted on what kind of races potentially are going to be practicing them, and that they're a more uncommon sight in the big civilized kingdoms and cities and whatnot that you have in your setting. If you're doing that, you then have to consider like, are all barbaric peoples part of the greater druidic nature worshipping kind of culture, or are they still like themselves a subsect of a larger barbarian culture that has just as many versions of the gods that the city folk have. And, you know, I just, you know, the way they're written up, there's, like, no way to, like, without massively revising it to dial back some of the more kind of goofy magic things that go on with druids. I've found from myself that whenever at the times I have run 5th edition D&D and other versions of D&D in the past, I feel like it's much more likely to have someone who wants to play a druid than have someone who has to play a cleric. So since, you know, at least from that kind of anecdotal evidence, if they are kind of the preferred, you know, divine class for players nowadays, then, you know, you need to do a little bit more work to actually incorporate them into whatever kind of theocratic structures that are built into the, you know, world you're designing if you're doing a homebrew, or if you're trying to, like, modify and personalize the published setting for your own purposes. Rangers are more than just, you know, scouts and, you know, hunters and all that kind of stuff. I feel what's kind of missing from Rangers and their generic presentation is that they should be regarded as lawmen. They're wandering marshals. Even going back to the Aragorn stereotype from Lord of the Rings, you know, they're an organized group of, like, wilderness knights almost, who are charged, you know, with guarding the North, even if the North doesn't realize they're being guarded. So, you know, depending on the setting, you know, they can either be, you know, like an established order that has ancient roots but doesn't answer to anyone nowadays. They're kind of, at this point, just this self-sustaining, self-appointed guardians of the wilderness. Or, you know, they can actually be invested with legal authority by, you know, one of the material type kingdoms that are currently operating and control the region and all that kind of stuff. Regardless, there should be some sort of organization of Rangers in the world. You know, it's a bit more than just some, like I said, they're more than just like an average wilderness scout, or, you know, some guy going around hunting deer with a bow and arrow. You know, their training is a bit specialized. You know, hunting and tracking on, you know, of that kind of level is supposed to be, you know, kind of like the D&D equivalent of being like military special forces. In terms of how they're incorporated into military structures for more kind of like war-themed campaigns, you know, fighters give you most of your range for knights and infantrymen and all that kind of stuff. Rangers, like I said, like, you know, if you're looking for a modern-day analog and you're not going to go with the wandering lawman kind of thing from the West kind of stuff, then you know, treating them as like, you know, special forces, Navy SEALs units of Forgotten Realms isn't necessarily a bad approach. Still kind of gives them that authoritative, we've been, you know, given authority by the king to come and secure this place, and because they have all these like subversive, sneak around, tactical kind of skills, you know, that actually kind of lends themselves. And I mean, it comes right down to it. Some of our military special forces call themselves fucking Rangers, so, you know. Yeah, is it the most original observation of mine? I don't know. You decide. In the comments below. The last one of what I call the wilderness classes is probably the most iffy on whether or not that's really like the best way to describe it. But since I'm trying to break, you know, 12 classes down into 3 sections, each one's got to get 4. And so of the magic using classes, I'm going to include the Sorcerer. Largely because, you know, they don't need any kind of schooling or conspiracy group to have learned their magic at all. You know, wizards, you know, have needed some form of instruction, whether it's going to a magic school or direct apprenticeship or having just self-studied books and all that kind of stuff entirely on their own, and just figuring it out slowly. Warlocks, you know, while as they're gaining their, you know, magic from an external power, you know, they pretty much all kind of imply, you know, the person becoming a warlock would have to have learned a good amount of knowledge about the entity that they're trying to have made contact with in the first place to cut whatever the bargain was that gave them this power in exchange for their servitude. In some ways, I feel warlocks should kind of be treated as like kind of like a soft divine class in and of themselves, because you know, whether or not you're worshiping eldritch beings or the Fae, you know, that lends itself to having its own little cult around it. Except instead of deriving power from the gods, you're, you know, deriving power from supernatural evil. But to your average person, peasant who doesn't understand the workings of magic, they can be easily fooled into thinking that it's equivalent to a cleric or a paladin's abilities. Sorcerers kind of pop up out of random, and so if you're going for like an all-focused wilderness game where you're only using these 4 wilderness classes, they would be probably the magic user that best qualifies, because they can just kind of pop up out of any population at random. Their appeal is that they're very high concept kind of characters. You know, if you want to play a chaos mage, or the whole dragon-blooded thing, where eventually you start to be able to grow wings and all that kind of stuff. Which, if you combine with a dragonborn, it can lead to some like really potent power sets as you advance in things. They're great for that. I think they have got like a Elemental Tempest Storm themed one in one of the various side books. Of the various classes, their variety of sub-options is actually their greatest strength, compared to some other classes where having all these little variants that you lean into as you level up kind of maybe detracts from just the core essence of, here's your class, get better at this class, kind of a thing that older D&D had. On the other hand, like in terms of magic, you got to be way more careful about what you choose, since you have such a more limited amount of spells that you learn compared to wizards or warlocks, or even some of the other non-magic classes that can gain pseudo-magic abilities as they specialize as they level up. Which if you're looking for a complete and total custom ability, and to do everything you might want to do with your sorcerer character, you might not quite get there. I also find that just because various people tend to kind of think the same in terms of what spells are best, you'll probably end up finding that most people playing sorcerers will end up kind of always choosing the exact same spells as they level up, because of the things listed, and you only get to choose 1 or 2. Well, I guess I'm going with the one that lets me throw the fireball that does the most damage, and that kind of stuff. So there is that drawback to sorcerers. But yeah, as I said, if you're going for like some entirely uncivilized Mad Max and or Stone Age kind of thing, they work with that too. Sorcerers are I guess your best option. There's wiggle room. Warlocks also kind of could also be made to fit into your more barbaric settings. But like I say, in order to be able to like break this up into bite-sized chunks and not make a 2-hour-long video about the whole damn thing, sorcerers are going to be here with rangers, druids, and barbarians for these purposes alone. So anyway, the other 2 groups I'm going to be talking about are going to be the Civilized Classes and the Classic 4. So stay tuned for that. Leave comments below, hit like and subscribe. And until next time, words that you expect me to say at the end of my video.